The sun had barely peeked over the horizon when I stirred from my slumber, the familiar sounds of Ravenwood Village rousing me from dreams I couldn't quite remember. I blinked away the vestiges of sleep, my eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the cracks in our wooden walls. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and sea salt, the aroma of home. I sat up, careful not to disturb Astrid, who slept peacefully beside me. Her golden hair splayed across the furs, and I couldn't help but smile at the sight. How had I gotten so lucky? As I dressed, I heard the village coming to life outside. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the bleating of goats, and the chatter of children filled the air. It was a symphony I knew by heart, one that had been the backdrop of my entire life. I stepped outside, breathing deeply. The cool morning air filled my lungs, invigorating me for the day ahead. Old Torstein hobbled by, nodding in greeting. "Mornin', Eric," he called out. "Looks to be a fine day for fishing." I grinned back at him. "Aye, that it does. May Njord bless your catch, old friend." As Torstein continued on his way, I made my way to the center of the village. Women were already gathered around the communal ovens, the smell of baking bread making my stomach growl. Children darted between houses, their laughter echoing off the wooden structures. "Eric," a familiar voice called out. I turned to see Astrid jogging towards me, her blue eyes sparkling in the morning light. She reached me, slightly out of breath, and planted a quick kiss on my cheek. "I thought you were still asleep," I said, wrapping an arm around her waist. She smirked. "And let you start the day without me? Never." We began to walk through the village, our fingers intertwined. The weight of her hand in mine felt right, like it had always belonged there. "So," Astrid began, a hint of excitement in her voice, "have you given any more thought to what we discussed last night?" I felt a flutter in my chest, remembering our conversation about starting a family. "I have," I replied, squeezing her hand, "and I think I'm ready." Astrid's face lit up, her smile brighter than the morning sun. "Really? Oh, Eric." She threw her arms around my neck, and I lifted her off her feet, spinning her around as she laughed. As I set her down, I saw the hope and love shining in her eyes. "We'll need a bigger house," I mused, already mentally planning the extension. Astrid nodded, her mind clearly racing with possibilities. "And we'll need to start storing extra food for the winter. Oh, and I'll have to speak with Helga about her remedies for morning sickness." I chuckled, placing a finger on her lips to stem the flood of words. "One step at a time, my love. We have all the time in the world. If only I had known how wrong I was." We continued our walk, discussing our future, painting a picture of the life we dreamed of. As we passed the longhouse, we saw a group of warriors training in the yard. Among them was my childhood friend Bjorn, his axe flashing in the sunlight as he sparred with a younger warrior. "Eric," Bjorn called out, lowering his weapon. "Come to finally learn how to swing an axe properly?" I laughed, releasing Astrid's hand to clasp Bjorn's forearm in greeting. "And deprive you of your one talent? I wouldn't dare." Astrid rolled her eyes at our banter. "I'll leave you two to your boasting. I promise to help with the weaving today." She gave me a quick peck on the lips before heading off towards the weaver's hut. Bjorn watched her go, a wistful expression on his face. "You're a lucky man, Eric." "Don't I know it?" I agreed, my eyes following Astrid until she disappeared from view. Bjorn clapped me on the shoulder. "Come, let's get a drink. We need to discuss our upcoming voyage." We made our way to the mead hall, nodding to fellow villagers as we passed. Inside, the hall was warm and inviting, the smell of last night's feast still lingering in the air. We settled at a table, and soon had horns of mead in hand. "To successful raids and full coffers," Bjorn toasted, raising his horn. I clinked mine against his. "And to returning home safely?" As we drank, Bjorn leaned in, his voice low. "I've heard rumors of rich monasteries along the eastern coast. Minimal defenses, lots of gold. Could be our most profitable voyage yet." I frowned, swirling the mead in my horn. I don't know, Bjorn. Raiding monasteries. It doesn't sit right with me. They're not warriors. Bjorn scoffed. Since when did you become so soft? Their god can protect them if he's so powerful. Besides, think of what that gold could do for Ravenwood, for your future family. His words struck a chord. The idea of providing a better life for Astrid and our future children was tempting. Still, a nagging doubt persisted in the back of my mind. I'll think about it, I conceded, draining the last of my mead. As the day wore on, I found myself distracted by thoughts of the future. The possibilities seemed endless, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly content. Little did I know that fate had other plans. As evening fell, dark clouds began to gather on the horizon. The air grew heavy with the promise of rain, and an uneasy stillness settled over the village. I stood at the edge of the cliff overlooking the sea, watching as the storm approached. Astrid joined me, wrapping her arms around my waist and resting her head on my shoulder. "Looks like a big one coming," she murmured. I nodded, pulling her closer. "Aye, it does. Best get inside soon." We stood there for a moment longer, watching as lightning flickered in the distance. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of rain and something else, something I couldn't quite place. "Eric," Astrid said softly, "promise me something?" I turned to face her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Anything." Her eyes met mine, filled with an emotion I couldn't decipher. "Promise me that no matter what happens, you'll always be the man I fell in love with. The kind, brave Eric who values peace as much as strength." Confused by her sudden seriousness, I cupped her face in my hands. "Astrid, what's brought this on?" She shook her head, forcing a smile. "It's nothing, just... promise me." "I promise," I said, sealing the vow with a kiss. As we made our way back to our home, the first drops of rain began to fall. We bid goodnight to our neighbors, everyone hurrying to shelter from the impending storm. Once inside, we prepared for bed, the sound of rain pattering on the roof creating a soothing rhythm. I lay awake for a while, listening to Astrid's steady breathing beside me. Despite the peace of the moment, a sense of unease had taken root in my chest. Perhaps it was Astrid's strange request, or the approaching storm, but something felt off. As I finally drifted off to sleep, my dreams were plagued by unsettling images. A raven with blood-red eyes perched on a pile of bodies, its caw sounding more like a human scream. I saw Ravenwood in flames, heard the clash of swords and the cries of the dying. And through it all, the raven watched, its eyes seeming to bore into my very soul. I jolted awake, my heart pounding. The storm raged outside, lightning illuminating the room in brief, harsh flashes. Beside me, Astrid slept on, unaware of my distress. As I lay there trying to calm my racing thoughts, I couldn't shake the feeling that this night marked the end of something. The end of peace, perhaps, or the end of the Eric I had always been. If only I had known then how prophetic those dreams would prove to be. For in the coming days, the Eric who valued peace would be burned away, replaced by a man consumed by vengeance. And Ravenwood, my beloved home, would never be the same again. The clash of steel on steel tore through the night, ripping me from my slumber. For a moment I lay frozen, my mind struggling to comprehend the sounds assaulting my ears. Screams of terror and pain mingled with war cries, creating a horrifying cacophony that shattered the peace of Ravenwood. "Eric! Eric, wake up!" Astrid's voice, tight with fear, finally jolted me into action. I leapt from our bed, fumbling in the darkness for my axe. "What's happening?" I asked, though in my heart, I already knew the answer. "We're under attack," Astrid replied, her voice surprisingly steady as she quickly dressed. "I think it's Saxons." A bone-chilling scream from outside confirmed her words. I gripped my axe tighter, my mind racing. "We need to get to the longhouse. It's the most defensible position." Astrid nodded, grabbing a shield from the wall. What about your parents? Their house is on the other side of the village. My heart clenched at the thought. I'll get them. You head to the longhouse and help organize the defense. No. Astrid grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with fear. We should stay together. It's too dangerous to split up. Before I could respond, our door burst open. A Saxon warrior, his face twisted in a feral grin, stood in the doorway. Without hesitation, I hurled my axe, watching as it buried itself in the man's chest. He fell backward with a gurgle, his blood staining our threshold. We don't have time to argue, I said, retrieving my axe from the fallen Saxon. I'll be right behind you. Now go. Astrid hesitated for a moment, then pulled me in for a fierce kiss. Don't you dare die on me, Eric. You promised me a future, remember? With that, she was gone, darting out into the chaos of the night. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I knew would be a nightmarish journey through our once peaceful village. As I stepped outside, the full extent of the attack hit me like a physical blow. Homes were ablaze, casting a hellish glow over the scene. Bodies littered the ground, some Saxon, but far too many were familiar faces from Ravenwood. The air was thick with smoke and the metallic scent of blood. I began to run towards my parents' house, cutting down any Saxon that crossed my path. My axe rose and fell, each stroke fueled by a mix of fear and rage. A young Saxon, barely more than a boy, lunged at me with a spear. I parried the thrust and buried my axe in his skull, trying to ignore the way his features reminded me of Leif, one of the village children. Eric, a familiar voice called out. I turned to see Bjorn, his face streaked with blood and soot, fighting off two Saxons near the village well. Without hesitation, I charged to his aid, taking one of the attackers from behind. Together we made short work of them. Have you seen my parents? I asked, scanning the area for more threats. Bjorn shook his head, panting heavily. No, but I saw a group of Saxons heading towards that part of the village. We need to hurry. We ran through the burning streets, the heat of the fires searing our skin. The sounds of battle seemed to come from every direction, disorienting in their intensity. We passed the body of old Torstein, his unseeing eyes staring up at the smoke-filled sky. I felt a pang of guilt, remembering our conversation just yesterday about fishing. As we neared my parents' house, my heart sank. The roof was ablaze, flames licking hungrily at the night sky. No, 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 I muttered, increasing my pace. We burst through the door, coughing as thick smoke assaulted our lungs. Mother, father, I called out, desperately searching through the inferno. Bjorn grabbed my arm, pointing towards the bedroom. There! I saw them then, and the image would be forever seared into my memory. They lay in their bed as if merely sleeping, but the growing pool of blood told a different story. Their throats had been cut, a coward's method that denied them even the chance to fight back. Eric, we can't stay here. Bjorn's voice seemed to come from far away. The roof's about to collapse. I stood rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from my parents' lifeless forms. It was Bjorn who finally dragged me out, just as a burning beam crashed down where we had been standing. Outside, I fell to my knees, retching. The reality of what had happened, what was still happening, threatened to overwhelm me. Bjorn's hand on my shoulder brought me back to the present. I'm sorry, my friend, he said, his voice thick with emotion. But we need to keep moving. There are still people we can save. I nodded, forcing myself to stand. A new determination filled me, fueled by grief and a growing rage. The longhouse, I said. We need to get to the longhouse. We fought our way through the village, gathering survivors as we went. Young Leif, his eyes wide with terror, clung to my leg until I hoisted him onto my back. Hold tight, little one, I told him. I won't let them hurt you. As we neared the center of the village, I scanned the crowd for Astrid. Surely she had made it to the longhouse by now. The thought of her safe behind its sturdy walls gave me strength. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. A scream cut through the air, a voice I would have recognized anywhere. "Astrid!" I yelled, handing Leif to Bjorn. "Get them to safety. I have to find her." Before he could protest, I was running towards the sound of Astrid's voice. I found her near the edge of the village, surrounded by 3 Saxon warriors. She was fighting fiercely, her shield dented and her sword red with blood, but I could see she was tiring. With a roar of rage, I charged into the fray. My axe found its mark in the back of one Saxon, nearly cleaving him in 2. Astrid took advantage of the distraction to dispatch another, leaving only one opponent. He was a large man, his arms corded with muscle and his face scarred from countless battles. He grinned at us, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "Well, well," he said in heavily accented Norse. "Looks like we have some fighters here." "You'll pay for what you've done to our village," I snarled, readying my axe. The Saxon laughed. "Your village? Boy, this land belongs to us now. Your people are just in the way." He lunged forward, his sword a blur of motion. I parried his strike, the impact sending shockwaves up my arm. Astrid moved to flank him, but he was quicker than his size suggested. He kicked out, catching her in the stomach and sending her sprawling. "Astrid!" I cried out, momentarily distracted. It was all the opening the Saxon needed. His sword slipped past my guard, biting deep into my side. I stumbled back, warm blood soaking my tunic. The Saxon pressed his advantage, raining down blows that I could barely deflect. Just as I thought it was over, Astrid appeared behind him. With a cry of fury, she plunged her sword into his back. The Saxon's eyes widened in surprise, then emptied as life left him. I sagged in relief, but the reprieve was short-lived. More Saxons were approaching, drawn by the sounds of our fight. "Eric," Astrid said, her voice weak. I turned to her, and my blood ran cold. She was pale, too pale, and clutching her stomach. Blood seeped between her fingers from a wound I hadn't seen her receive. "No," I whispered, catching her as she fell. We collapsed to the ground together, the approaching Saxons momentarily forgotten. "Astrid, hold on," I pleaded, pressing my hand to her wound. "We'll get you to the healer. You'll be fine." She smiled up at me, her blue eyes clouded with pain. "Liar," she whispered. "You always were terrible at lying." I could hear the Saxons getting closer, but I couldn't bring myself to move. "Please," I begged, tears streaming down my face. "Don't leave me. We were supposed to have a future, remember?" Astrid reached up, her blood-stained hand caressing my cheek. "I love you, Eric," she said, her voice barely audible. "Promise me. Promise me you won't let this change you. Don't let them win by becoming like them." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Astrid's eyes drifted closed, her hand falling limply to her side. A primal scream of grief and rage tore from my throat, echoing across the burning village. The world around me faded away. I was vaguely aware of the Saxons reaching us, of raising my axe one last time in a futile gesture of defiance. Then something hard struck the back of my head and darkness claimed me. As consciousness slipped away, my last thought was of Astrid's final words. Little did I know how thoroughly I would fail to keep that promise. For in that moment, as Ravenwood burned and my love died in my arms, the Eric she had known died too. In his place, a creature of vengeance was born, one that would bring a reckoning upon those who had destroyed everything I held dear. The Saxon invasion of Ravenwood was brutal, but the revenge that would follow would shake the very foundations of the world. The first thing I became aware of was pain. It radiated from every part of my body, a dull, throbbing ache that seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. The second thing was the cold. I was lying on something hard and unyielding, the chill seeping into my bones. Slowly, I forced my eyes open. The world was a blur of shadows and flickering light. As my vision cleared, I realized I was in a cave. The dancing light came from a small fire near the entrance, casting long shadows on the rough stone walls. I tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness forced me back down. A groan escaped my lips, alerting the other occupants of the cave to my consciousness. "Eric? Eric, can you hear me? A familiar voice reached my ears. Bjorn's face swam into view, his features etched with concern. Bjorn? My voice was a rasp, my throat dry and raw. What? Where are we? Bjorn helped me into a sitting position, supporting my weight as another wave of dizziness hit me. Easy, my friend. You've been out for 2 days. 2 days? The fog in my mind began to clear, and with it came the memories. The attack, the fires, my parents, Astrid. Oh gods, Astrid. No, I whispered, the full weight of what had happened crashing down on me. No. Bjorn's grip on my shoulder tightened. I'm sorry, Eric, I'm so sorry. I looked around the cave, really seeing it for the first time. There were others here, huddled in small groups. I recognized faces from Ravenwood, but there were so few. Too few. How many? I asked, dreading the answer. Bjorn's face fell. 23. That's all we could save. 23? Out of a village of over 200. The magnitude of our loss was staggering. You saved me, I said, the realization dawning on me. I remember being surrounded by Saxons. How did you... I couldn't leave you behind, Bjorn replied, his voice thick with emotion. When I saw you fall, I couldn't let them have you. We fought our way to you, managed to drive them back long enough to get you out. I nodded, unable to find words to express my gratitude. Instead, I asked, where are we? The old bear cave, about a league north of the village, Bjorn explained. It was the only place I could think of that the Saxons might not know about. As we talked, I noticed movement from the corner of my eye. A small figure was approaching us hesitantly. It was Leif, the young boy I had carried during the attack. His face was smudged with dirt and tears, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and hope. Eric, he said in a small voice, you're awake? I forced a smile onto my face, though it felt more like a grimace. Hello, Leif. Are you all right? The boy nodded, then without warning threw himself into my arms. I bit back a groan of pain, wrapping my arms around his shaking form. I was so scared, Leif sobbed into my chest. The bad men, they killed my mama and papa. I don't know what to do. My heart broke for the child. How many others here had similar stories? How many had lost everything, just as I had? It's okay, Leif, I murmured, stroking his hair. We're going to be okay. But even as I said the words, I knew they were a lie. Nothing would ever be okay again. As Leif's sobs subsided, I looked around at the other survivors. They were watching us, their eyes filled with a mix of grief, fear, and something else. Hope. They were looking to me, I realized with a start. They were waiting for me to tell them what to do. Bjorn seemed to sense my realization. They need a leader, Eric, he said quietly. They need you. I shook my head, panic rising in my chest. No, I can't. I'm not a leader. I couldn't even save my own family. How am I supposed to lead them? Because you're still standing, came a voice from across the cave. Helga, the village healer, approached us. Her normally kind face was set in hard lines, her eyes burning with a fierce determination. We're all that's left of Ravenwood, Eric, and right now we need someone to remind us why we should keep fighting. I looked at the faces around me, saw the mix of despair and hope in their eyes. These were my people, what was left of my home, and they were looking to me. Slowly, painfully, I got to my feet. Bjorn moved to support me, but I waved him off. If I was going to do this, I needed to stand on my own. My friends, I began, my voice gaining strength as I spoke. We have lost everything. Our homes, our loved ones, our way of life. The Saxons came in the night and tried to destroy us. I paused, letting my gaze move over each face in the cave. But they failed. We are still here. We are still Ravenwood. A murmur of agreement rippled through the group. I continued, feeling a fire ignite in my chest. They thought they could break us, but they underestimated the strength of our people. We will not fade away into the night. We will not go quietly. The murmur grew louder, heads nodding in agreement. We will rebuild. We will grow stronger. And we will have our revenge. The last word hung in the air, heavy with promise. I saw the change in their eyes, saw grief and fear give way to determination and anger. The Saxons think they've won, I said, my voice dropping to a growl. They think we're beaten, but they're wrong. We are the children of Ravenwood, descendants of warriors and survivors, and we will show them the true meaning of vengeance. A cheer went up from the group, echoing off the cave walls. I saw Bjorn watching me, a mix of pride and concern on his face. But I couldn't focus on that now. The fire in my chest had grown, fueled by the grief and rage that had been building since the attack. As the cheers died down, I began outlining our next steps. First, we need to assess our resources, food, weapons, anything we manage to salvage. Bjorn, can you handle that? He nodded, already moving to organize a group for the task. Helga, we need to tend to our wounded. Anyone with any healing knowledge, work with her. The old healer nodded grimly, calling for volunteers. The rest of you, start thinking about what skills you have that could be useful. Hunting, foraging, weapon craft, anything that can help us survive and grow stronger. As the cave burst into activity, I felt a tug on my sleeve. It was Leif, his young face set in a determined expression that looked out of place on a child. "What about me, Eric?" he asked. "What can I do?" I knelt down to his level, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You, Leif, have the most important job of all. You need to remember." His brow furrowed in confusion. "Remember what?" "Everything," I said softly. "Remember Ravenwood as it was. Remember the people we lost. Remember why we're fighting. Can you do that for me?" Leif nodded solemnly, his young eyes far too old for his years. "I'll remember, Eric. I promise." As I watched him go, joining a group of other children huddled near the fire, I felt a presence at my side. It was Bjorn, his face grave. "This path you're setting us on, Eric," he said quietly. "It's dangerous. Revenge. It can consume you if you're not careful." I turned to him, feeling the weight of leadership settling onto my shoulders. "I know, old friend, but what choice do we have? We can't let them get away with this." Bjorn sighed, running a hand through his matted hair. "Just don't lose yourself in this, Eric. Astrid wouldn't want—" "Don't," I cut him off, my voice sharp. "Don't tell me what Astrid would want. She's gone, Bjorn. They're all gone. And the only thing that matters now is making the Saxons pay for what they've done." I saw the concern in his eyes, but I couldn't bring myself to care. The Eric that Astrid had loved, the one who valued peace and kindness, had died with her in the burning ruins of Ravenwood. In his place stood a man forged in fire and grief, a weapon honed for one purpose, vengeance. As I turned back to the bustling activity in the cave, I felt a grim satisfaction. This was just the beginning. The Saxons had sown the wind with their attack on Ravenwood. Now, they would reap the whirlwind. Little did I know then how high the cost of that vengeance would be, not just for our enemies, but for us as well. The path I set us on that day in the cave would lead us to places darker than I could have imagined, testing not just our strength but our very humanity. But in that moment, standing among the last remnants of my people, all I could feel was the burning need for retribution. And I embraced it, letting it fill the hollow spaces left by all I had lost. Ravenwood had fallen, but from its ashes, something new and terrible was rising, and the world would tremble before us. The forest was silent save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the cool morning breeze. I crouched behind a thick oak, my eyes fixed on the Saxon camp sprawled before us. Beside me, Bjorn shifted slightly, his breath misting in the crisp air. "I count at least 50 men," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Maybe more inside the tents." I nodded, committing every detail to memory. The layout of the camp, the positions of the sentries, the location of the weapons cache, all of it would be crucial for what was to come. "Their defenses are weak," I murmured. "They're not expecting any resistance." Bjorn's face tightened. "They think they've broken us." A cold smile twisted my lips. "Then they're in for a rude awakening." We watched for a while longer, noting the changing of the guards and the routines of the camp. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, we retreated deeper into the forest, making our way back to our hidden cave. The past week had been a blur of preparation. We had scavenged what we could from the ruins of Ravenwood, raided isolated farmsteads for supplies, and pushed ourselves to the brink of exhaustion training for the fight to come. Now, finally, we were ready to strike back. As we entered the cave, I was met with expectant faces. Our small band of survivors had transformed in the days since the attack. Gone were the broken, grieving villagers. In their place stood hardened warriors, their eyes burning with the same thirst for vengeance that consumed me. "What news, Eric?" Helga asked, her usually gentle voice now sharp with anticipation. I moved to the center of the cave, where we had scratched a crude map of the area into the stone floor. "The Saxon camp is here," I said, pointing to a spot on the map. "They're confident, complacent, their guard is down." A murmur of satisfaction ran through the group. I continued, outlining what we had observed. As I spoke, I could see the plan forming in their minds, the same brutal strategy that had been taking shape in my own thoughts for days. When I finished, silence fell over the cave. It was Leif, his young face set in a grim mask, who broke it. "When do we attack?" I looked at the boy, seeing not the child he was, but the warrior he was becoming. "Soon," I promised. "But first, we prepare." The cave burst into activity. Weapons were sharpened, armor was mended, and strategies were discussed in hushed, intense conversations. I moved among them, offering guidance and encouragement where needed. As the day wore on, I found myself standing at the mouth of the cave, staring out at the forest. The world seemed unchanged, oblivious to the storm that was brewing within our hidden sanctuary. I closed my eyes, trying to center myself to find some peace in the quiet of the wilderness. Instead, all I could see was Astrid's face, her eyes wide with pain as she died in my arms. My parents, lying still in their blood-soaked bed. The burning ruins of Ravenwood, smoke rising like a funeral pyre for all we had lost. "Eric?" Bjorn's voice pulled me from my dark thoughts. I turned to find him watching me, concern etched on his weathered face. "Are you sure about this?" I frowned. "About what?" He gestured vaguely towards the cave where our people were preparing for war. "All of this, the attack, the brutality of it, is this really who we want to become?" For a moment I was taken aback. Bjorn had been my staunchest supporter, my right hand in all our preparations. To hear doubt from him now was jarring. "Who we want to become," I repeated, my voice low and dangerous. "We didn't choose this, Bjorn. They made this choice for us when they burned our home and slaughtered our people." Bjorn held up his hands placatingly. I know. I'm not saying we shouldn't fight back. But this plan... Eric, we're talking about slaughtering them in their sleep, torturing their leaders for information. Is that really justice?" I turned away, unable to meet his gaze. "Justice?" I spat the word like a curse. There is no justice for what they've done. All we have left is vengeance. "And what happens after?" Bjorn pressed. "When the blood price is paid, what then? Can we go back to being who we were?" His words struck a chord deep within me, touching on fears I had been trying to ignore. I whirled on him, anger flaring hot in my chest. "We can never go back," I snarled. "Don't you understand? The people we were died in Ravenwood. All that's left is this anger, this pain, this need to make them suffer as we have suffered." Bjorn took a step back, surprise and something like fear flashing across his face. I had never raised my voice to him before. Never let him see the full extent of the rage that burned within me. "Eric," he said softly, "this isn't you. This isn't what Astrid would have—" "Don't!" I cut him off, my voice like the crack of a whip. "Don't you dare tell me what Astrid would have wanted. Astrid is dead. They killed her, Bjorn. They killed her and my parents and everyone we ever cared about. And now you want to talk about justice, about who we're becoming?" I advanced on him, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. "I'll tell you who we're becoming. We're becoming the nightmare that will haunt their dreams. We're becoming the vengeance that they brought down upon themselves. And if you can't stomach that, if you're too weak to do what needs to be done, then maybe you should leave now." The words hung in the air between us, sharp and poisonous. Bjorn's face paled, hurt evident in his eyes. For a moment I felt a pang of regret, a flicker of the old Eric who would never have spoken to his friend this way. But then the moment passed and the cold rage reasserted itself. I turned away, dismissing him. "Go check on the weapons. Make sure everything is ready for tomorrow." I heard him hesitate behind me as if he wanted to say more. But then his footsteps retreated, leaving me alone with my thoughts once more. As night fell, I gathered everyone for a final briefing. The excitement was palpable, an electric current running through our small band of survivors. I looked at each face in turn, seeing my own thirst for revenge reflected back at me. "Tomorrow," I began, my voice carrying to every corner of the cave, "we take back what's ours. We show the Saxons that Ravenwood is not so easily destroyed. We show them the price of underestimating us." A cheer went up, quickly hushed lest it carry beyond our hidden sanctuary. I continued, outlining the plan one last time. "We move in 3 groups. Bjorn will lead the first, attacking from the east. Helga, you take the second group from the west. I'll lead the main assault from the north." I paused, making sure I had everyone's full attention. "Remember, this is not a battle. This is an execution. No mercy, no prisoners. Every Saxon in that camp dies, no matter their age or status. Is that understood?" A chorus of agreement met my words. I saw some faces tighten at the brutality of the order, but no one voiced any objections. They had all lost too much to feel any compassion for our enemies. "Good," I nodded. "Get some rest. We move at first light." As the group dispersed, I caught sight of my reflection in a polished shield leaning against the wall. For a moment, I didn't recognize the man staring back at me. His eyes were hard, his face set in lines of grim determination. This was not the Eric who had laughed and loved in the peaceful days of Ravenwood. But then, that Eric was dead. He had died with Astrid, with my parents, with every friend and neighbor lost in the flames. This new Eric, this creature of vengeance and fury, was all that remained. And tomorrow, the Saxons would learn to fear him. As I prepared for bed, my mind racing with plans and contingencies, I heard a small voice behind me. "Eric?" I turned to find Leif standing there, his young face a mix of excitement and fear. "What is it, Leif?" He shuffled his feet, suddenly seeming very young. I'm scared," he admitted in a whisper. "What if something goes wrong? What if we fail?" For a moment I was at a loss. How could I reassure him when my own doubts gnawed at the edges of my determination? But then I knelt down, placing my hands on his shoulders. "Listen to me, Leif," I said, my voice low and intense. "We will not fail. Do you know why?" He shook his head, his eyes wide. "Because we have nothing left to lose," I told him. "The Saxons took everything from us. Our homes, our families, our future. All we have left is each other and our desire for revenge, and that makes us more dangerous than they could ever imagine." I saw my words sink in, saw the fear in his eyes replaced by a hard resolve that no child should ever have to feel. "We'll make them pay," he said, his voice steady, "for everyone we lost." "Yes," I agreed, feeling a fierce pride mixed with a deep sadness. "We will make them pay. Now get some sleep. Tomorrow, We become the vengeance of Ravenwood. As Leif scurried off to his sleeping area, I stood, my resolve hardening. Tomorrow would change everything. We would no longer be victims, no longer be prey. Tomorrow we would become the predators, and the Saxons would learn the true meaning of fear. Little did I know then how that transformation would cost us, how the price of vengeance would be paid not just in Saxon blood, but in our own humanity. But in that moment, on the eve of our brutal retribution, all I could feel was a grim satisfaction. The storm was coming, and we were the tempest. The pre-dawn forest was shrouded in mist, the world holding its breath in anticipation of the coming day. I crouched at the edge of the tree line, my eyes fixed on the Saxon camp below. Behind me I could feel the presence of our warriors, their bodies tense with anticipation, their breaths coming in quiet, controlled pants. "Remember," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Wait for my signal." Not a moment before. A chorus of soft grunts acknowledged my order. I allowed myself a grim smile. We had come so far from the broken survivors huddled in a cave. Now we were hunters, predators poised to strike. As the first hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, I saw movement in the Saxon camp, the changing of the guard, right on schedule. I raised my hand, signaling to Bjorn and Helga in their hidden positions on either side of the camp. "Now," I breathed. From the undergrowth, Leif emerged, his young face set in determination. In his hands he carried a roughly made straw effigy, soaked in lamb's blood. Our bait. Leif moved with surprising stealth, placing the effigy just within sight of the Saxon sentries before darting back into the safety of the trees. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a shout of alarm went up from the camp. "Odin's beard, what is that? Some kind of pagan magic?" I watched as two Saxon guards cautiously approached the effigy, their weapons drawn. Just a few steps more. The ground gave way beneath them, plunging them into the spiked pit we had so carefully prepared. Their screams echoed through the morning air, a beautiful chorus to my ears. "Now!" I roared, all pretense of stealth abandoned. We burst from the trees, a wave of vengeance crashing down upon the unsuspecting Saxons. The sounds of battle filled the air, the clash of steel on steel, the thud of arrows finding their marks, the screams of the dying. I waded into the fray, my axe rising and falling in a deadly rhythm. Each stroke was fueled by memories of Ravenwood, of Astrid, of all we had lost. A Saxon warrior rushed at me, his sword held high. I ducked under his wild swing and buried my axe in his gut, feeling a savage satisfaction as the light faded from his eyes. "Eric." Bjorn's voice cut through the chaos. "Their leader, he's making for the horses." I spun, catching sight of a large man in ornate armor trying to mount a startled horse. With a snarl of rage, I charged towards him, cutting down anyone foolish enough to get in my way. The Saxon leader saw me coming. He abandoned the horse and turned to face me, his sword gleaming in the early morning light. "So," he sneered, "the dogs still have some fight left in them." "More than you can imagine," I growled, circling him warily. He lunged, his sword a blur of motion. I parried, the impact sending shockwaves up my arm. He was strong, I had to give him that. But I was fueled by something far more powerful than mere strength. We traded blows, neither gaining the upper hand. Around us, the battle raged on, but it felt distant, unimportant. This man, this leader of the Saxons who had destroyed my world, he was all that mattered. "You should have finished the job," I spat, deflecting another of his strikes. "You should have made sure we were all dead." The Saxon laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "And deny ourselves the pleasure of hunting down the stragglers? Where's the fun in that?" His words ignited a fresh wave of fury within me. With a roar of rage, I redoubled my attack, my axe becoming a whirlwind of death. The Saxon leader's eyes widened in surprise, then fear, as he found himself driven back by the ferocity of my assault. Finally, I saw my opening. As he overextended on a thrust, I stepped inside his guard. My axe found his throat biting deep. He fell to his knees, blood bubbling from his lips as he stared up at me in disbelief. I leaned in close, wanting him to hear my next words clearly. "This is for Ravenwood," I hissed. "For Astrid. For everyone you murdered." With a final decisive stroke, I ended his life. As his body crumpled to the ground, I became aware of the silence that had fallen over the camp. I looked up to see that the battle was over. Our ambush had been a complete success. Bjorn approached me, his face and armor splattered with blood. "It's done," he said quietly. "We've won." I nodded, surveying the carnage around us. Bodies littered the ground, the vast majority wearing Saxon colors. But I could see our own dead as well, their faces peaceful in death, finally reunited with those we had lost in Ravenwood. "Gather the wounded," I ordered, "and search the tents. I want anything of value: weapons, food, information." As our warriors moved to comply, I caught sight of Leif standing over a fallen Saxon. The boy's sword was red with blood, his young face a mask of grim satisfaction. Something twisted in my gut at the sight, a flicker of the man I used to be recoiling at what we had turned this child into. But I pushed the feeling aside. This was the world we lived in now, the reality we had to embrace to survive. "Leif," I called out. He turned to me and I saw a darkness in his eyes that mirrored my own. "You did well today. Your parents would be proud." A smile spread across his face, tinged with an edge of madness that sent a chill down my spine. "We made them pay, Eric," he said, his voice filled with a joy that was terrifying in its intensity. "We made them all pay." I nodded, unable to find words to respond. Instead, I turned my attention to the task at hand, directing our people as we stripped the camp of anything useful. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Helga approached me, her face grim. "Eric," she said, her voice low, "we found something in the leader's tent. You need to see this." She led me to a large tent at the center of the camp. Inside, spread out on a rough wooden table, was a map. My blood ran cold as I realized what I was looking at. "It's not just us," I breathed, tracing the markings on the map with a shaking finger. "They're planning to attack every village in the region." Bjorn, who had followed us into the tent, swore softly. "We have to warn them," he said. "We can't let what happened to Ravenwood happen to others." I stood in silence for a long moment, my mind racing. Part of me, the part that still clung to the values of the old Eric, agreed with Bjorn. We had a duty to protect others from suffering our fate. But another part, the part born in fire and blood, saw an opportunity. "No," I said finally, my voice hard. "We don't warn them. We use this." Bjorn and Helga exchanged worried glances. "What do you mean?" Helga asked cautiously. A cold smile spread across my face. "We know where they're going to strike next. We can be there waiting for them. We can bleed them dry, one raid at a time." "Eric," Bjorn said, his voice filled with concern. That's not what we agreed. We were supposed to get our revenge and then..." "And then what?" I snapped, rounding on him. "Go back to farming? Pretend none of this ever happened? There's no going back, Bjorn. This is who we are now." I turned back to the map, my mind already formulating plans. "We'll move from village to village, always one step ahead of the Saxons. We'll rally the people, teach them to fight, and when the Saxons come, we'll be there to greet them." "And what of Ravenwood?" Helga asked quietly. "What of rebuilding our home?" I met her gaze, seeing the mixture of fear and hope in her eyes. "Ravenwood is gone," I said, my voice softening slightly. "But we carry it with us, in our hearts, in our memories, and in our vengeance." For a long moment, silence reigned in the tent. Then, slowly, Bjorn nodded. "As you say, Eric," he said, though I could hear the reservation in his voice. "We follow where you lead." As we emerged from the tent, I saw our people gathered, waiting for direction. Their faces were a mix of exhilaration from our victory and uncertainty about what came next. I climbed atop a nearby crate, raising my voice to address them all. "People of Ravenwood," I began, feeling the weight of their expectations on my shoulders. "Today we have struck a mighty blow against those who sought to destroy us. But our work is not done." I held up the map for all to see. "The Saxons plan to do to others what they did to us. But we will not let that happen. We will be the shield that protects the innocent, the sword that strikes down the wicked." A murmur ran through the crowd. I could see the idea taking hold, see the fire of purpose igniting in their eyes. "From this day forward, we are no longer merely the survivors of Ravenwood. We are its vengeance, its justice. We are the storm that will sweep these invaders from our lands." A cheer went up, growing in volume until it echoed through the forest. As I looked out over the sea of faces, I felt a sense of grim satisfaction. We had taken our first step on a new path, one that would lead us to glory or destruction. But in that moment, with the blood of our enemies still fresh on our blades and the thrill of victory singing in our veins, none of that mattered. We were alive, we were strong, and we had a purpose. The Saxons had sought to extinguish the spirit of Ravenwood. Instead, they had forged it into something new and terrible, and the world would tremble before us. As the cheers died down and we began to prepare for our next move, I caught sight of my reflection in a polished shield. The face that looked back at me was one I barely recognized, harder, colder, with eyes that burned with an almost feverish intensity. I smiled at my reflection, embracing this new self. The old Eric was truly dead, consumed by the fires of Ravenwood, and from those ashes, a leader had been born, one who would stop at nothing to see justice done. The ambush was over, but our war had only just begun. The forest was alive with the sounds of panic. Shouts of alarm, the clash of weapons, and the thundering of hooves filled the air as we pursued the fleeing Saxons. This was the third raid we had intercepted in as many weeks, and our reputation was growing. No longer were we the victims. We had become the hunters. I sprinted through the underbrush, my lungs burning with exertion. Ahead of me, I could see a group of Saxon warriors trying to escape on horseback. With a snarl of determination, I put on an extra burst of speed. "Leaf!" I shouted. "The trees!" From the branches above, Leaf appeared like a spirit of vengeance. He loosed arrow after arrow, each finding its mark with deadly accuracy. Horses reared and fell, throwing their riders to the ground. I was on them in an instant, my axe rising and falling in a brutal rhythm. Blood sprayed, staining the forest floor crimson. One Saxon, younger than the rest, held up his hands in surrender. "Please," he begged, his eyes wide with terror. I yield. "Have mercy." For a moment, I hesitated. His face was so young, barely more than a boy. But then I remembered Ravenwood, remembered Astrid dying in my arms, and my resolve hardened. "There is no mercy," I growled, bringing my axe down in a final, decisive stroke. As the last Saxon fell, silence descended on the forest. I stood there panting, surrounded by the carnage we had wrought. Leaf trees landing lightly beside me. "We got them all, Eric," he said, his young face flushed with excitement. "Not a single one escaped." I nodded, feeling a grim satisfaction. "Good work, Life. Is improving." Boy beamed at the praise, and I felt a twinge of something, guilt, regret. I pushed the feeling aside. This was the world we lived in now. There was no room for softness. "Eric," Bjorn's voice called out. He emerged from the trees, leading a group of our warriors. His face was grim as he surveyed the scene. "We've secured the camp. You'll want..." I followed Bjorn back to the Saxon encampment. As we walked, I could feel his unease radiating off him in waves. "Something troubles you, old friend?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Bjorn was a moment before speaking. "Eric, don't you think we're going too far?" "You killed. He was surrendering." I stopped, turning to face him. And if we had let him go, he would have run back to his people, told them of our tactics, made them better prepared for next time. But killing an unarmed opponent, Bjorn trailed off, shaking his head, is not our way. It's not who we are. Who we are, I laughed. And bitter, who we were, Ravenwood, Bjorn. This is who we are now. This is what they made us. Bjorn looked like he wanted to argue further, but we had arrived at the camp. Helga approached us, her face tight with worry. Eric, she said, her voice low. We found prisoners in the camp. Village folk they were planning to sell as slaves. My blood ran cold. How many? 12, mostly women and children. I nodded, my mind already racing with possibilities. Good. They'll spread the word of what we've done here. Our legend will grow. Helga and Bjorn exchanged a look. Eric, Helga said carefully, some of them, they saw what we did to the Saxons. They're terrified of us. For a moment, I felt a flicker of doubt. Was this really what we had become? A force so brutal that even those we saved feared us? But I pushed the thought aside. Fear was a tool, one we could use to our advantage. Let them be afraid, I said coldly. Fear will keep them safe. Fear will make them strong. I strode into the camp where the freed prisoners huddled together, their eyes wide with a mixture of relief and terror. I stood before them, acutely aware of the blood staining my armor, my axe still dripping red. People of the villages, I began, my voice carrying across the clearing. You have been saved from a fate worse than death. The Saxons would have sold you into slavery, torn you from your homes and families. I paused, letting my gaze sweep over each face. But know this, your old lives are over. The Saxons will come again and again until there is nothing left of our people, unless we stand against them. A woman cradling a young child spoke up. But we're not warriors. We're farmers, craftsmen. How can we fight? I smiled, though there was no warmth in it. You will learn, we all learned. The Saxons taught us the price of weakness, and we have become strong. Now, we will teach you. Murmurs ran through the group, a mixture of fear and hesitant hope. I continued, my voice growing in intensity. Join us. Become part of our force. Together, we will drive the Saxons from our lands. We will make them pay for every life they've taken, every home they've destroyed. As I spoke, I could see the change in their eyes. Fear gave way to anger, to a thirst for vengeance that mirrored our own. This was how we would grow, how we would become strong enough to truly challenge the Saxon invasion. One man stood up, his fists clenched at his sides. I'll join you, he said, his voice shaking with emotion. They killed my brother. I want them to pay. Others followed, pledging themselves to our cause. With each new recruit, I felt our power growing. We were no longer just the survivors of Ravenwood. We were becoming an army. As the new recruits were led away to be armed and given basic training, Bjorn approached me again. His face was troubled. Eric, he said softly, we need to talk about the man we captured, the one who killed Astrid. I felt a cold fury settle in my gut. In the heat of battle, I had almost forgotten. We had finally found him, the Saxon responsible for taking my love from me. Where is he? I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. Bjorn hesitated before answering. We have him secured in one of the tents. But Eric, what are you planning to do? I met his gaze, seeing the concern there. What needs to be done? I said simply. He will pay for what he did, and the others will learn the price of crossing us. As I turned to go, Bjorn caught my arm. Eric, please. Think about what Astrid would want. This path we're on, it's changing us. Changing you. For a moment, I almost faltered. The memory of Astrid's last words echoed in my mind. Don't let them win by becoming like them. But then I remembered her lifeless body in my arms, and my resolve hardened once more. Astrid is dead, I said, my voice cold. and the man responsible is about to learn the true meaning of vengeance. I shook off Bjorn's grip and strode towards the prisoner's tent. As I entered, I saw him, the Saxon who had taken everything from me. He was bound, his face bruised and bloody from the initial capture, but his eyes still held a defiant gleam. "So," he spat as I approached, "you're the leader of this band of savages." I said nothing, simply staring at him. In my mind, I saw Astrid's face, heard her laugh, felt the warmth of her embrace. And then I saw her dying, this man's sword red with her blood. "You don't even remember her, do you?" I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "You killed so many that day. She was just one more victim to you." Confusion flickered across the Saxon's face, followed by a dawning realization. "The girl," he said slowly, "the one who fought like a she-wolf. She was yours?" Something snapped inside me at his words. With a roar of rage, I lashed out, my fist connecting with his jaw. He fell back, spitting blood. "Her name was Astrid," I snarled, grabbing him by the throat. "And you're going to say it. You're going to remember her name as you beg for a death I won't give you quickly." What followed was a nightmare of pain and blood. I lost track of time as I exacted my vengeance, the Saxon's screams echoing through the camp. When it was finally over, when his broken body lay still at my feet, I emerged from the tent to find the entire camp watching in silence. I stood there, covered in blood, my chest heaving with exertion. In their eyes I saw fear, awe, and a terrible understanding. This was who we were now. This was the price of crossing us. "Let this be a message," I called out, my voice raw. "To every Saxon, to anyone who would threaten our people. This is the fate that awaits you. We are the vengeance of Ravenwood, and we will show no mercy." As I walked away, I caught sight of Leif watching me with a mixture of admiration and something darker. I realized with a start that I had become the very monster I had set out to destroy. But it was too late to turn back now. We had chosen our path, and we would see it through to the bitter end. The old Eric, the one who valued mercy and compassion, was truly dead. In his place stood a creature of vengeance, forged in the fires of loss and tempered by the blood of his enemies. And as I looked out over our growing army, I knew that this was only the beginning. The Saxons had sown the wind with their brutality. Now, they would reap the whirlwind, and may the gods have mercy on them, for we certainly would not. The sun had barely crested the horizon when I emerged from my tent, the cool morning air a stark contrast to the fire that burned within me. Our camp, once a hastily assembled collection of shelters, had grown into a formidable stronghold. The ruins of Ravenwood were long behind us now, both in distance and in spirit. As I made my way through the camp, I saw our people preparing for the day ahead. Warriors honed their weapons, scouts readied themselves for patrols, and new recruits drilled under the watchful eyes of our most experienced fighters. The air thrummed with purpose and barely contained violence. "Eric!" a voice called out. I turned to see Bjorn approaching, his face etched with concern. "We need to talk." I nodded, gesturing for him to follow me to the command tent. Once inside, I turned to face my old friend. "What troubles you, Bjorn?" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Word of our exploits has spread. Warriors from other villages are arriving, seeking to join us." "Good," I replied, a cold smile spreading across my face. "We need the numbers if we're to drive the Saxons from our lands." Bjorn shook his head. "It's not just that. These men, they're not like our people. They're not fighting for revenge or to protect their homes. They're here for glory, for the promise of battle and plunder." I considered his words for a moment. And why should that concern us? Their motivations matter little, so long as their swords are sharp and their arms are strong. "Eric, please," Bjorn implored, his voice low and urgent. "Think about what we're becoming. We set out to protect our people, to avenge Ravenwood. But now, we're starting to look more like the very raiders we're fighting against." His words struck a chord deep within me, touching on doubts I had been trying to ignore. For a moment, I saw myself through Bjorn's eyes, a blood-soaked warlord leading a horde of killers. But I pushed the thought aside. There was no room for doubt. Not now. "We are what we need to be," I said, my voice hard. "The world has changed, Bjorn. If we're to survive, we must change with it." Before Bjorn could respond, Leif burst into the tent, his young face flushed with excitement. "Eric, there's a group of warriors here to see you. They say they've come from the northern fjords." I exchanged a glance with Bjorn before following Leif out of the tent. In the center of our camp stood a group of battle-hardened men, their armor adorned with symbols I didn't recognize. Their leader, a towering man with a scar running down the left side of his face, stepped forward as I approached. "So," he said, his voice a deep rumble, "you're the one they call the Vengeance of Ravenwood." I met his gaze steadily. "I am. And you are?" "Thorvald Bloodaxe," he replied, a fierce grin spreading across his face. "My men and I have sailed south, drawn by tales of your victories against the Saxon dogs. We would join your cause, if you'll have us." I studied Thorvald and his men carefully. They were clearly experienced warriors, the kind of fighters we desperately needed. But I could also see the bloodlust in their eyes, the hunger for battle that went beyond mere vengeance. "And what do you seek in return for your service?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Thorvald's grin widened. "Only the chance to spill Saxon blood and take our share of the spoils. Is that not fair?" I nodded slowly. "It is. Welcome to our ranks, Thorvald Bloodaxe. We march at dawn." As Thorvald and his men moved to set up their camp, Bjorn pulled me aside. "Eric, are you sure about this? These men are little more than pirates." "They're warriors," I countered, "and we need every sword we can get." Before Bjorn could argue further, Helga approached, her face grim. "Eric, we've received word from our scouts. A large Saxon force is gathering to the east. They mean to crush us once and for all." A thrill of anticipation ran through me at her words. "How many?" "At least 300 men, maybe more." I smiled, a cold, dangerous expression that I saw reflected in the faces of those around us. "Good. Let them come. We'll show them the true meaning of fear." As word spread through the camp, I could feel the energy changing. The air crackled with excitement and nervous energy. This was what we had been waiting for, a chance to prove ourselves against a true Saxon army. I climbed atop a nearby boulder, raising my voice to address our gathered forces. "Warriors of Ravenwood and beyond, the time has come to show the Saxons the full measure of our strength. They think to crush us, to wipe us from these lands as they did to so many before." A low growl ran through the crowd at my words. I continued, my voice rising in intensity. "But they will find no easy victory here. We are not frightened villagers to be slaughtered in our beds. We are the storm that will sweep them from our shores." A cheer went up, weapons raised in salute. I saw Thorvald and his men watching with approving grins, their bloodlust stoked by my words. Tomorrow we march to meet them, and when the sun sets, the ground will be soaked with Saxon blood, for Ravenwood, for vengeance. The answering roar was deafening, a primal cry of rage and anticipation. As I jumped down from the boulder, Leif approached me, his young face alight with excitement. "Eric," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "I want to fight with the main force tomorrow. I'm ready. I can do it." I looked at the boy. No, the young man, before me. Gone was the frightened child I had rescued from the ruins of Ravenwood. In his place stood a hardened warrior, his eyes burning with the same fire that consumed us all. "Are you sure, Leif?" I asked, though I already knew his answer. "It will be dangerous," he nodded firmly. "I'm sure. I want to make them pay for what they did to my family, to all of us." I clasped his shoulder, feeling a surge of pride mixed with a sadness I couldn't quite name. "Very well. You'll fight by my side. But remember your training, and stay close." As Leif hurried off to prepare, Helga approached. Her face was troubled as she watched the boy go. "He's so young, Eric. Too young for this kind of battle." "We were all too young," I replied, my voice hard. "The Saxons made sure of that when they burned our world to ashes." Helga sighed, shaking her head. "I fear for him, for all of us. This path we're on, where does it end?" I turned to her, my eyes blazing with an intensity that made her step back. "It ends with every Saxon driven from our lands. It ends with us reclaiming what was taken from us. And if that means we must become monsters to defeat monsters, then so be it." As night fell, I made my way through the camp one last time. Everywhere I saw our people preparing for the battle to come. Weapons were sharpened, armor was mended, and final prayers were whispered to gods who seemed to have abandoned us long ago. In my tent I found Bjorn waiting for me. His face was grave as he watched me begin to don my armor. "Eric," he said softly, "I need you to promise me something." I paused, looking at my old friend. "What is it?" "Promise me that after this battle, win or lose, we'll talk about our future, about what comes next." I felt a flicker of irritation at his words. "What comes next is clear. We keep fighting until there isn't a single Saxon left on our shores." Bjorn shook his head. "And then what?" "We can't fight forever, Eric. At some point we have to think about rebuilding, about becoming something more than just an army of vengeance." His words struck a chord deep within me, touching on doubts I had been trying to ignore. For a moment I saw a glimpse of a different future, one where we laid down our weapons and returned to the simple lives we had once known. But then I remembered Astrid's face as she died in my arms, remembered the flames of Ravenwood reaching towards the sky, and I knew there could be no going back. "We'll talk after the battle," I said finally, my voice low. "But make no mistake, Bjorn. This is who we are now. This is what they made us." As Bjorn left the tent, I finished donning my armor. I caught my reflection in a polished shield and barely recognized the man staring back at me. My eyes were hard, my face set in grim lines. I was no longer Eric the farmer, the man who had dreamed of a peaceful life with Astrid. I was Eric the Vengeance, leader of a growing army, the scourge of Saxons everywhere, and tomorrow I would prove just how far I was willing to go to see our enemies destroyed. As I stepped out of my tent, ready for the battle to come, I saw Leif waiting for me. His face was set in determined lines, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. In that moment I felt a surge of pride mixed with a deep sadness. This was what we had become, an army forged in fire and blood, ready to unleash our fury upon those who had wronged us. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten as our forces assembled. I took my place at the head of our army, Leif by my side and Bjorn and Helga flanking me. Behind us stretched hundreds of warriors, their faces set in grim determination. As the first rays of sun broke over the horizon, I raised my axe high. "For Ravenwood," I roared, "for vengeance." The answering cry shook the very earth beneath our feet, and as we began our march towards the waiting Saxon army, I knew that this day would change everything. Win or lose, there would be no going back from what we were about to do. The storm of our vengeance was about to break upon our enemies, and may the gods have mercy on their souls, for we certainly would not. The sky was ablaze with the colors of dawn as I stood atop a small hill, surveying the aftermath of our latest victory. The battlefield below was littered with bodies, the vast majority wearing Saxon colors. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood and the acrid smell of smoke from the burning Saxon camp. "Eric!" Bjorn's voice called out as he approached, his armor splattered with blood. "The last of the Saxon forces have retreated. We've won the day." I nodded, a grim satisfaction settling in my chest. "Casualties?" Bjorn's face tightened. "We lost 23. Another 40 are wounded, but Helga thinks most will recover." 23. The number hit me harder than I expected. Each loss was a reminder of what we were fighting for, of the price we paid for our vengeance, but it was a price I was willing to pay. "And the Saxons?" I asked, my voice hard. A cold smile spread across Bjorn's face. Over 200 dead. The rest fled like the cowards they are. I allowed myself a moment of pride. We had come so far from the broken survivors huddled in a cave. Now we were a force to be reckoned with, striking fear into the hearts of our enemies. As we made our way back to the main camp, I saw Leif helping tend to the wounded. The boy, no, the young man, had fought like a demon possessed during the battle. His sword had run red with Saxon blood, his face a mask of cold fury as he cut down enemies twice his size. "Leif," I called out. He looked up, his eyes brightening as he saw me approach. "Eric, did you see? I took down 3 of them myself." His voice was filled with a mixture of pride and something darker, a thirst for violence that both pleased and troubled me. I clasped his shoulder, feeling the tension in his muscles. "You fought well today, Leif. Your parents would be proud." A shadow passed over his face at the mention of his parents, quickly replaced by a fierce determination. "Next time I'll kill even more. I'll make them all pay for what they did to us." I nodded, recognizing the fire in his eyes. It was the same fire that burned within me, the all-consuming need for vengeance that had driven us to this point. As we continued through the camp, I saw warriors from various villages gathered around fires, sharing tales of their exploits. The word of our victories had spread far and wide, attracting fighters from all corners of the land. We were no longer just the survivors of Ravenwood. We had become a beacon for all those who sought vengeance against the Saxon invaders. Helga approached, her hands stained with the blood of those she had tended. "Eric, we need to talk." I followed her to a quiet corner of the camp, away from prying ears. Her face was grave as she turned to face me. "What is it, Helga?" I asked, though I suspected I knew what was coming. She took a deep breath before speaking. "Eric, this path we're on, it's changing us, all of us. I've seen the look in our warriors' eyes. They're not fighting for protection anymore or even for vengeance. They're fighting because they've developed a taste for it." Her words struck a chord deep within me, touching on fears I had been trying to ignore. "What would you have me do, Helga? Turn the other cheek? Let the Saxons take everything from us?" "No," she said firmly. "But we need to remember why we started this. We were protectors once, not conquerors." I felt a flash of anger at her words. "The world changed, Helga. We changed with it. This is who we are now." She reached out, placing a hand on my arm. "Is it? Is this really who you want to be, Eric? What would Astrid say if she could see us now?" The mention of Astrid's name sent a jolt of pain through my chest. For a moment I saw her face, heard her laugh, felt the warmth of her embrace, and then I remembered her dying in my arms, her last words a plea for peace. I shook off Helga's hand, my voice low and dangerous. "Astrid is dead. They killed her. They killed all of them. And I will not rest until every last Saxon has paid for what they've done." Helga's eyes filled with sadness. "Then I fear we've already lost, Eric. We've become the very thing we set out to destroy." Before I could respond, a commotion from the edge of the camp caught our attention. A group of warriors was approaching, led by a man I didn't recognize. His armor was finer than most, his bearing that of a leader. "Who is that?" I asked one of our scouts as we approached. "Calls himself Håkon the Bold," the scout replied. "Says he's a jarl from the north, come to join our cause." I stepped forward to meet the newcomer, studying him carefully. Håkon was a large man, his face scarred from countless battles. His eyes held a cunning that set me on edge. "So," Håkon said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet camp, "this is the great Eric, the vengeance of Ravenwood. I must say I expected someone older." I met his gaze steadily. "Age matters little in war, Håkon the Bold. It's skill and will that count." He laughed, a booming sound that seemed to shake the very ground. "Well said. I've come with my men to join your cause. The tales of your victories have spread far and wide. We want a piece of the glory, and the spoils." I felt Bjorn tense beside me at the mention of spoils. This was a delicate moment, one that could shape the future of our movement. We welcome all who would stand against the Saxon invaders, I said carefully. But know this, we fight for vengeance and for the protection of our people, not for personal gain. Haakon's eyes narrowed slightly. Come now, Eric. Surely you're not so naive. Men fight for many reasons, but gold and glory are always near the top of the list. I felt a ripple of unease go through our gathered warriors. Haakon's words held an appeal, especially for those who had joined us more recently. The purity of our original purpose was being challenged. Our cause is just, I said, my voice carrying across the crowd. We fight to drive the Saxons from our lands to avenge those we've lost. If that brings glory, so be it. But never forget why we began this fight. Hakon studied me for a long moment before nodding. Fair enough. My men and I will fight under your banner, Eric of Ravenwood. But remember, loyal men deserve rewards for their service. As Hakon and his warriors moved to set up their camp, I felt a tug on my sleeve. It was Leif, his young face troubled. Eric, he said quietly, are we becoming like them? Like the Saxons? The question hit me like a physical blow. I knelt down to look Leif in the eye, seeing the conflict there. No, Leif, we're not like them. We fight to protect, to avenge. They fight for greed and conquest. But even as I spoke the words, I felt a flicker of doubt. The line between protector and conqueror was becoming increasingly blurred. As night fell, I found myself standing at the edge of the camp, looking out over the darkened landscape. The weight of leadership felt heavier than ever, the choices ahead more uncertain. Copper for your thoughts? Bjorn's voice came from behind me. I turned to see my old friend approaching, 2 horns of ale in his hands. He offered one to me, which I accepted gratefully. Do you ever wonder, I asked after taking a long drink, if we've gone too far? If we've lost sight of what we originally set out to do? Bjorn was silent for a long moment before responding. Every day, he said softly. But then I remember Ravenwood burning. I remember Astrid, your parents, all those we lost, and I know we can't stop, not until it's finished. I nodded, feeling a mix of gratitude and sadness at his words. But when is it finished, Bjorn? When do we say enough is enough? He shrugged, taking a drink from his own horn. I don't know. Maybe when there isn't a single Saxon left on our shores. Maybe when we've rebuilt everything they destroyed. Or maybe... Maybe what? I prompted when he trailed off. Bjorn met my gaze, his eyes filled with a sorrow that mirrored my own. Maybe it's never finished. Maybe this is just who we are now. His words hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. We stood in silence for a while, each lost in our own thoughts. Finally, I spoke. We can't go back, can we? To who we were before. Bjorn shook his head. No, I don't think we can. But maybe we can still choose who we become from here. As if to punctuate his words, a cheer went up from the main camp. We turned to see Hakon regaling a group of warriors with tales of his past exploits. The men hung on his every word, their eyes shining with the promise of glory and riches. We're at a crossroads, I said, more to myself than to Bjorn. The choices we make now will determine what kind of force we become. Bjorn nodded. And what kind of man you become, Eric? The men look to you. They'll follow where you lead. The weight of his words settled on my shoulders like a physical burden. I thought of Astrid, of the future we had dreamed of together. How far I had strayed from the man she had loved. But then I remembered her dying in my arms, remembered the flames of Ravenwood reaching towards the sky, and I knew there could be no turning back. We'll drive the Saxons from our lands, I said, my voice hard with resolve. We'll make them pay for every life they've taken, every home they've destroyed. And if that means we have to become something new, something terrible, then so be it. Bjorn studied me for a long moment before nodding. Then we're with you, Eric. to whatever end. As we made our way back to the main camp, I saw Leif watching us. His young face was set in lines of grim determination, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. In that moment, I saw a reflection of myself, of what I had become and what he was becoming. The boy I had rescued from the ruins of Ravenwood was gone. In his place stood a warrior, forged in the fires of vengeance and tempered by the blood of our enemies. And I realized, with a mixture of pride and sadness, that this was my true legacy. We had set out to protect our people, to avenge our losses. But in the process, we had become something more, something that both thrilled and terrified me. We were no longer just survivors or even avengers. We were becoming a force that could reshape the very world around us. As I looked out over our growing army, I felt a surge of power. The Saxons had sought to extinguish us, to wipe us from the face of the earth. Instead, they had created something far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. We were the vengeance of Ravenwood, the nightmare that would haunt their dreams. And our rise to power was only just beginning. The dawn of a new era was breaking, and it would be heralded by the clash of steel and the cries of our enemies. The old world was dying, consumed by the fires of our vengeance. And from its ashes, we would forge a new one. A world shaped by our will and paid for in Saxon blood. As I stood there, surrounded by our ever-growing forces, I felt a grim smile spread across my face. The Saxons had no idea what was coming for them, but they would learn. Oh, how they would learn. The air in Ravenwood hung heavy with the stench of blood and smoke. I stood atop the wooden palisade, surveying the land that had become my kingdom. The forests that once echoed with laughter and life now whispered with the ghosts of the fallen. My hands, calloused and scarred, gripped the rough-hewn wood as I contemplated how far we'd come, and how far I'd fallen. "Eric, a visitor approaches." Gunnar, my most loyal warrior, called from below. I squinted into the setting sun, spotting a hunched figure making its way slowly towards our gates. "Open them," I commanded, my voice hoarse from years of barking orders and battle cries. As I descended the ladder, I felt the weight of every eye in Ravenwood upon me. They feared me, respected me, maybe even hated me. But they followed me, and that was all that mattered. The gates creaked open, revealing an ancient woman, her face a map of wrinkles and her eyes clouded with age. Yet there was a sharpness to her gaze that made me uneasy. "Who are you, old woman?" I demanded, hand resting on the hilt of my sword. She cackled, a sound like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "I am Helga, the seer. I have come with a message for the Lord of Ravenwood." I scoffed. "I have no use for superstitions and prophecies. Be on your way." Helga's eyes narrowed. "You would do well to listen, Eric Bloodhawk. The gods have shown me your future, and it is as dark as the ravens that circle your walls." A murmur ran through the gathered crowd. I felt a flicker of doubt, quickly smothered by anger. "Speak your piece then, witch, and be done with it." The old woman raised her gnarled staff, pointing it at my chest. "I see a man consumed by vengeance, his soul as black as the ashes of his enemies. I see a kingdom built on bones and held together by fear. And I see it all crumbling, Eric Bloodhawk. The cycle of violence you've created will consume you and all you hold dear." I laughed, but it sounded hollow even to my own ears. "Is that all? I've heard better threats from children playing at war." Helga shook her head sadly. "It is not a threat, but a warning. The path you walk leads only to destruction. There is still time to change course, to break the cycle." "Enough!" I roared, drawing my sword. The crowd gasped, but I had no intention of striking the old woman. Instead, I pointed the blade at the gates. "Leave now, before I decide your ramblings are a threat to my people." As Helga turned to go, she fixed me with one last piercing stare. "Remember my words, Eric. The cycle of violence will consume you all." I watched her hobble away, trying to ignore the chill that ran down my spine. As the gates closed behind her, I turned to address my people. "Pay no heed to the ravings of a mad woman. I declared. We are strong, we are feared, and we will crush anyone who dares to stand against us. A cheer went up, but it lacked the usual enthusiasm. I saw doubt in their eyes, and it filled me with rage. Later that night, as I sat alone in my hall nursing a horn of mead, a knock came at the door. "Enter," I growled. Leif, once the young boy I'd saved from the ashes of our old village, now a man grown and one of my most trusted warriors, stepped inside. His face was troubled. "What is it, Leif? Speak your mind." He hesitated, then squared his shoulders. "Eric, I can't help but think about what the old woman said. Are we truly on the right path?" I slammed my fist on the table, making him flinch. "You too? Have I surrounded myself with cowards and fools?" "No, Eric, it's not that," Leif said quickly. "It's just, do you remember when you saved me? When you vowed revenge? I thought you were the bravest man I'd ever seen. But now what?" I snarled. Leif met my gaze, and I saw a glimmer of the boy he once was. "Now I wonder if we've become what we once hated. The Saxons destroyed our home, killed our families. But look at what we've done. How many homes have we burned? How many families have we torn apart?" His words hit me like a physical blow. For a moment I saw myself through his eyes. Not a hero, not a leader, but a monster wearing the skin of a man. "Get out," I whispered. "Eric, please." "Get out!" I roared, hurling my drinking horn at him. It missed, shattering against the wall as Leif fled. Alone once more, I paced the hall like a caged beast. The old woman's words echoed in my mind, mingling with Leif's doubts and my own suppressed guilt. I caught sight of my reflection in a polished shield hanging on the wall. I barely recognized the man staring back at me. My once bright eyes were now sunken and haunted, my face lined with scars and hatred. When had I become this thing? A commotion outside snapped me from my brooding. I rushed out to find Gunnar dragging a man towards me, his face grim. "My lord, we caught this dog trying to sneak out of Ravenwood," Gunnar reported, throwing the man at my feet. I recognized him. Halvard, one of our own warriors. "Explain yourself," I demanded. Halvard looked up at me, fear and defiance warring in his eyes. I was leaving to warn the nearby villages about you, about what you're planning." Shock rippled through the gathered crowd. I felt a familiar rage building inside me, but beneath it was something else. Fear. "You would betray us?" I growled. "After everything we've been through?" Halvard struggled to his feet. "No, Eric, I'm trying to save us from ourselves, from you. This path we're on, it will destroy us all, just like the old woman said." I saw nods of agreement in the crowd, heard whispers of assent. The rage won out. "You speak of betrayal?" I roared. "I'll show you the price of betrayal." What followed was a blur of violence and screams. When I came back to myself, my hands were slick with blood, and Halvard's broken body lay at my feet. The crowd had drawn back, horror etched on every face. "Let this be a lesson," I panted, gesturing to Halvard's corpse. "This is the fate of all who would betray Ravenwood, who would betray me." As I stalked back to my hall, I heard the whispers begin. Plots and schemes, born of fear and resentment, the seeds of rebellion sown by my own hand. I barred the door and sank to the floor, the weight of my actions finally crashing down upon me. The old woman's final words rang in my ears. "The cycle of violence will consume you all." And in that moment, as the first rays of dawn crept through the cracks in my fortress of vengeance, I realized with terrifying clarity that her prophecy had already begun to unfold. The storm clouds gathered on the horizon, dark and ominous, mirroring the dread that had settled in my gut. I stood atop Ravenwood's highest tower, my eyes scanning the vast expanse before me. The land that had once been my playground, then my battleground, now stretched out like a graveyard of broken dreams and shattered lives. "My lord," Gunnar's gruff voice broke through my reverie. "The scouts have returned." I turned to face my most loyal warrior, noting the tightness around his eyes, the grim set of his jaw. Report, I commanded, steeling myself for the news I knew was coming. Gunnar swallowed hard. It's as we feared, Eric. They've united against us. The Saxons, the Danes, even some of our own people. They're forming an army unlike anything we've ever faced. I nodded, a bitter smile twisting my lips. How fitting. The monster of Ravenwood has finally roused the villagers, pitchforks and all. This is no jest, Eric, Gunnar growled. Their numbers, they say it's like a sea of men, stretching as far as the eye can see. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel the weight of it all, the fear, the doubt, the crushing realization that this might be the end. But I couldn't afford such luxuries. Not now. Not ever. Then we'll drown them in their own blood, I snarled, my hand instinctively gripping the hilt of my sword. Gather the war council. We prepare for battle. As Gunnar hurried off, I cast one last look at the horizon. The storm was drawing closer, and with it, the reckoning I had always known would come. The great hall of Ravenwood, once a place of feasts and celebration, now echoed with the grim voices of warriors preparing for what might be their final stand. Maps were spread across tables, strategy debated in heated whispers. I stood at the head of it all, the mantle of leadership heavy on my shoulders. We should abandon Ravenwood, Sven, one of my older advisors, argued. Take what we can carry and slip away under cover of darkness. Live to fight another day. Coward. Astrid, our fiercest shield maiden, spat. We've bled for this land. I'll be damned if I run from it now. The argument escalated, voices rising until the hall rang with shouts and accusations. I let it wash over me, studying the faces of those who had followed me into the depths of hell and back. Some burned with the same fire of vengeance that had driven us for so long. Others looked tired, beaten, ready for it all to end, one way or another. Enough, I roared, silencing the room. All eyes turned to me, waiting for the words that would seal our fate. We stand and fight. Ravenwood is more than just a place. It's a symbol of everything we've built, everything we've become. If it falls, we fall with it. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, but I caught sight of Leif, standing in the shadows. His eyes met mine, filled with a sadness that cut deeper than any blade. And what have we become, Eric? He asked softly, his voice carrying in the sudden silence. What are we fighting for? The question hung in the air, heavy and accusing. I opened my mouth to respond, to rally them with tales of glory and revenge, but the words wouldn't come. For the first time in years, I found myself without an answer. We fight because we must, I finally said, my voice hoarse, because it's all we have left. The war council dispersed, each to their own tasks. As the others filed out, Leif approached me, his face etched with concern. Eric, he began, I've known you since I was a boy. You saved me, raised me, taught me everything I know. But this isn't the man I looked up to. This isn't the hero who swore to protect us. I felt a flicker of the old rage, the desire to lash out, to silence any voice that dared question me. But looking at Leif, I saw not just the man he'd become, but the frightened child I'd pulled from the ashes of our old life. What would you have me do? I asked, the weariness in my voice surprising even me. Surrender? Beg for mercy from those who have none? Leif shook his head. No, but maybe it's time to consider peace, to break the cycle, like the old seer said. We could send envoys, try to negotiate. Negotiate? I laughed bitterly. With the blood of thousands on our hands? No, Leif, it's far too late for that. We made our choice long ago, and now we must see it through to the end. Leif's shoulders sagged, defeat written in every line of his body. Then we're doomed, he whispered. As he turned to leave, I felt a sudden urge to call him back, to tell him that he was right, that I was sorry for the monster I'd become. But the words stuck in my throat, choked by pride and fear and years of hatred. The next few days passed in a blur of frantic preparation. We fortified our walls, sharpened our weapons, and prayed to gods we'd long since abandoned. The tension in Ravenwood was palpable, every face etched with the knowledge that these might be their final hours. On the eve of battle, I stood before my people one last time. They gathered in the courtyard, a sea of faces turned up to me, waiting for the words that would carry them into the jaws of death. "My friends," I began, my voice carrying over the crowd. "My family. Tomorrow we face our greatest challenge. An army stands at our gates seeking to destroy everything we've built. They call us monsters, savages, unworthy of the very air we breathe." A low growl rippled through the crowd, but I held up my hand for silence. "Perhaps they're right," I continued, surprising even myself with the admission. "We've done terrible things in the name of vengeance. We've become the very thing we once despised. But tomorrow we have a chance to write a different ending to our story." I paused, looking out over the faces of those who had followed me through hell. Men and women I had led, inspired, and yes, corrupted. I won't lie to you. The odds are against us. Many of us, perhaps all of us, will not see another sunset. But know this, what we fight for is more than just our lives. We fight for redemption, for the chance to prove that even the darkest heart can find its way back to the light. A cheer went up, swords clanging against shields. But as I scanned the crowd, I saw something I hadn't expected. Hope. Not the fierce, vengeful hope that had driven us for so long, but something softer, more human. As the crowd dispersed, Gunnar approached me, a rare smile on his weathered face. "Fine words, my lord. You've given them something to believe in." I nodded, the weight of responsibility settling over me like a shroud. "Let's hope it's enough." The night passed in restless anticipation. I tried to sleep, knowing I would need my strength, but my mind raced with memories and regrets. In the darkest hours before dawn, I found myself standing before the crude shrine we'd erected to our fallen comrades. "Astrid," I whispered, my fingers tracing the runes of her name. "My love, what would you think of me now? Of what I've become? Of what I've done in your name?" The silence that answered was deafening. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the horn sounded. The enemy was approaching. I donned my armor, each piece a reminder of battles past, of lives taken and blood spilled. My sword, once a symbol of justice, now felt heavy with the weight of countless atrocities. I emerged from my quarters to find Leif waiting, his own armor gleaming in the early morning light. "Eric," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I wanted you to know. No matter what happens today, it has been an honor to fight by your side." I clasped his shoulder, words failing me. In that moment, I saw not just the warrior he'd become, but the boy he'd been, the innocence I'd stolen from him in my quest for vengeance. "Leif," I managed finally, "if, when the battle turns against us, I want you to lead our people to safety, find a new home, a better life. Promise me." He started to protest, but I cut him off. "Promise me, Leif. Let one good thing come from all of this." After a long moment, he nodded. "I promise." We made our way to the walls, where our warriors waited, tense and ready. The sight that greeted us as we looked out over the battlefield stole the breath from my lungs. Gunnar had not exaggerated. It was indeed a sea of men, stretching as far as the eye could see. Banners of a dozen different clans and kingdoms fluttered in the morning breeze, united in their desire to see Ravenwood fall. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of what I'd done, of the monster I'd become that could unite so many against me. But there was no time for regrets now. "Archers!" I bellowed. "Make ready!" The twang of bowstrings filled the air as our first volley arced towards the approaching army. Men fell, but it was like trying to empty the ocean with a thimble. The enemy's war horn sounded, and the sea of men began to move. The siege of Ravenwood had begun. What followed was a nightmare of blood and steel. Wave after wave crashed against our walls, each repelled but at a terrible cost. Our defenders fell one by one, their bodies joining the growing pile at the foot of the walls. I fought like a man possessed, my sword a blur of death. But for every enemy I struck down, two more seemed to take their place. Slowly, inexorably, we were being overwhelmed. As the sun reached its zenith, I heard a sound that chilled my blood, the groan of wood giving way. Our gates, battered by a massive ram, were beginning to splinter. "Fall back!" I roared. "Defend the inner keep!" We retreated, fighting for every inch. I saw faces I knew, friends and comrades, fall to enemy blades. Each death was another weight on my soul, another testament to my failures. As we reached the steps of the keep, I turned to make a final stand. That's when I saw him. Leif, surrounded by a group of Saxon warriors, fighting desperately. Without thinking, I charged back into the fray, cutting a bloody path towards him. "Leif!" I screamed. "Hold on!" I reached him just as a Saxon blade slipped past his guard. Time seemed to slow as I watched the steel bite deep into his side. "No!" The word tore from my throat as I caught him, cradling his body as we fell to the blood-soaked earth. Leif looked up at me, his eyes already growing dim. "Eric," he gasped. "I'm sorry. I couldn't." "Shh," I soothed, feeling hot tears on my cheeks for the first time in years. "You have nothing to be sorry for. It's me, Leif. I'm the one who's sorry. For everything." He reached up, his bloodied hand touching my face. "Then make it right," he whispered. "End this. Find peace." With a final, shuddering breath, Leif, the last connection to the man I once was, died in my arms. I don't remember much of what followed. There was rage, yes, but also a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I fought my way back to the keep, Leif's last words echoing in my mind. As I reached the top of the steps, I turned to face the sea of enemies below. In that moment, looking out over the ruins of Ravenwood, the broken bodies of friend and foe alike, I finally saw the truth of what I'd become. "Enough," I whispered. Then louder, my voice carrying over the din of battle. "Enough!" To my surprise, the fighting began to slow, all eyes turning towards me. "This ends now," I declared. "Too much blood has been spilled, too many lives lost. I am Eric, once called Bloodhawk, and I surrender myself to your judgment." A hush fell over the battlefield as I cast aside my sword and shield. As enemy warriors cautiously approached, I caught sight of a familiar face among them. Bjorn, my childhood friend, now leading the army against me. Our eyes met, and in that moment, I saw not hatred or triumph, but a profound sadness. He nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement, perhaps even forgiveness. As I was led away in chains, I took one last look at Ravenwood, the fortress I'd built on a foundation of vengeance and blood. It was burning now, flames licking at the sky, a fitting pyre for the man I'd once been. The cycle of violence, as the old seer had predicted, had consumed us all. But perhaps, in its ashes, something new could grow. Something better. As the gates of Ravenwood closed behind me for the last time, I felt not defeat, but a strange sense of peace. The story of Eric Bloodhawk was over. Whatever came next would be a new tale entirely. The acrid smell of smoke and blood filled my nostrils as I surveyed what remained of Ravenwood. Our once proud fortress, built on the bones of our enemies and fortified by our relentless drive for vengeance, now lay in ruins. The wooden palisades that had stood strong for so long were splintered and burning, and the bodies of the fallen, both friend and foe, littered the ground like discarded playthings. I stood atop the last remaining tower, my armor dented and stained with the day's carnage. The weight of my sword felt heavier than ever, as if all the lives I'd taken with it were pulling it towards the earth. Below, the remnants of our forces fought with the desperation of cornered animals, while the seemingly endless horde of our enemies pressed ever closer. "Eric!" Gunner's voice, hoarse from shouting orders, cut through the din of battle. He limped towards me, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side. The outer walls have fallen, we can't hold them back much longer. I nodded grimly, having expected as much. How many of us are left? Gunner's face, already grim, darkened further. Maybe 100, no more than that. And our supplies. He trailed off, but I understood. We were out of options. Then we make our last stand here, I declared, my voice carrying over the clash of steel and the screams of the dying. We'll show these dogs the true meaning of Ravenwood's fury. A ragged cheer went up from the surviving warriors, but I could see the fear in their eyes. They knew, as I did, that this was the end. Yet they stood with me still, loyal to the last. The thought filled me with both pride and crushing guilt. As we prepared for our final charge, I caught sight of a familiar face among the enemy ranks. My heart clenched as I recognized Bjorn, my childhood friend, now leading the army against us. Our eyes met across the battlefield, and for a moment I saw the boy I once knew. Before the Saxons came, before the blood and the vengeance, before I became a monster. Eric! Bjorn's voice boomed across the chaos. It doesn't have to end this way. Surrender, and I swear on my life that your people will be spared. For a heartbeat, I considered it. The thought of saving what remained of my people was tempting, but I knew it was too late for me. There would be no mercy, no redemption for the butcher of Ravenwood. You know I can't do that, old friend, I shouted back. Our fates were sealed long ago. Bjorn's face fell, a mixture of sorrow and determination settling over his features. He raised his sword, signaling to his troops. Then may the gods have mercy on your souls, he murmured, though I couldn't hear him over the renewed roar of battle. I turned to my remaining warriors, my family in all but blood. This is it, I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil in my heart. We've fought long and hard, and we've done terrible things in the name of vengeance. But today, we fight not for revenge, not for glory, but for each other, for the memory of those we've lost, for Ravenwood. For Ravenwood! The cry was taken up by every throat, a final act of defiance in the face of certain doom. As we prepared to charge, I felt a presence at my side. It was Leif, his young face set in grim determination. Eric, he said, his voice barely audible over the din of battle. I want you to know, no matter what happens, I'm proud to have fought beside you. You saved me when I was a boy, gave me a purpose, a family. I felt my throat tighten with emotion. Leif, I began, but he cut me off. Let me finish, he insisted. I know you carry the weight of all we've done, but remember, we chose to follow you. Every raid, every battle, it was our choice too. Whatever judgment awaits us, we'll face it together. I clasped his shoulder, words failing me. In that moment, I saw not just the fierce warrior he'd become, but the frightened boy I'd pulled from the ashes of our old village. I opened my mouth to respond, to thank him for his loyalty, to apologize for the innocence I'd stolen from him. But before I could speak, a horn blasted, signaling the enemy's final assault. For Ravenwood, I roared, raising my sword high. For our fallen, charge! We poured down from our last stronghold like a tide of vengeance incarnate. I led the charge, my sword a blur of steel and blood. For a moment, it felt like old times, the thrill of battle, the singing of my blade, the primal roar of victory as my enemies fell before me. But it couldn't last. For every foe I struck down, 2 more took their place. I saw my warriors fall one by one, their final cries lost in the cacophony of battle. Gunner went down protecting my flank, his axe buried in the chest of a Saxon even as a spear pierced his heart. I wanted to mourn, to scream my defiance to the heavens, but there was no time. Only the next enemy, the next swing of the sword, the next breath that could be my last. As the battle raged on, I found myself separated from the main group, surrounded by a sea of enemies. My arms burned with fatigue, my vision blurred from sweat and blood. But still I fought on, each fallen foe a tribute to the memory of Ravenwood. Then, Through a gap in the press of bodies, I saw him. Bjorn, fighting his way towards me, his face a mask of grim determination. Our eyes met, and in that moment, I knew how this would end. "Eric," he shouted, cutting down one of my warriors who tried to intercept him. "It's over. Call off your men." "Never," I roared back, parrying a blow and dispatching another attacker. "Ravenwood fights to the last man." We clashed in a fury of steel on steel, old friends now mortal enemies. Bjorn had always been my equal in combat, and even exhausted as I was, we were evenly matched. Our swords sang a deadly duet as we fought amidst the chaos of the dying Ravenwood. "It didn't have to be this way," Bjorn grunted, barely avoiding a slash that would have opened his throat. "We could have found peace." I laughed bitterly, tasting blood. Peace. After what they did to us, to Astrid, there is no peace, Bjorn, only vengeance or death. Our battle raged on, a microcosm of the larger conflict around us. I could feel my strength ebbing, each parry and thrust a little slower than the last. Bjorn pressed his advantage, his attacks growing fiercer as he sensed victory within his grasp. Then, in a moment of distraction, I saw Leif fall. A Saxon blade caught him in the side, and I watched in horror as the light faded from his eyes. "No!" The cry tore from my throat, raw with anguish. In that split second of inattention, Bjorn's sword found its mark. I felt the cold bite of steel between my ribs, a searing pain that dropped me to my knees. The sounds of battle seemed to fade away, replaced by a dull roaring in my ears. Bjorn stood over me, his sword dripping with my blood. But there was no triumph in his eyes, only a deep, abiding sorrow. "I'm sorry, old friend," he said softly. "I truly am." As darkness began to creep in at the edges of my vision, I saw the spirits of those I'd lost. Astrid, her beauty unmarred by the violence of her death. My parents, their faces etched with disappointment and love. And life, looking not at me, but beyond, to a future I would never see. With the last of my strength, I gripped Bjorn's ankle. "The cycle," I gasped, the taste of copper flooding my mouth. "Break it. Don't let it consume you too." Bjorn knelt beside me, his hand on my shoulder. "I swear it, Eric. The violence ends here." I nodded, feeling a strange sense of peace wash over me. As my eyes closed for the final time, I saw Astrid reaching out to me, her expression a mix of sorrow and forgiveness. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though whether to her or to all those I'd wronged I couldn't say. "I'm so sorry." The world faded to black, the sounds of battle giving way to a profound silence. In my final moments, I felt the weight of my sins lifting, replaced by a hope that perhaps in death I might find the redemption that had eluded me in life. And so fell Eric Bloodhawk, once the scourge of Ravenwood, now just another soul claimed by the cycle of violence he had perpetuated. But as the flames of battle died down and the survivors began to take stock of the carnage, something unexpected happened. Bjorn, standing amidst the ruins of Ravenwood, raised his voice. "Enough," he cried, his words carrying across the battlefield. "Too much blood has been spilled this day. Too many lives lost to old hatreds and fresh vengeance. It ends now." Slowly the fighting ceased. Saxon and Dane alike lowered their weapons, exhausted and shell-shocked by the brutality of the battle. Bjorn moved among them, speaking words of peace and reconciliation. "We came here seeking justice," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But look around you. Is this justice? Or is it merely a continuation of the cycle that has claimed so many of our brothers and sisters?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Bjorn continued, gaining strength as he spoke. "Eric Bloodhawk is dead. Ravenwood has fallen. But we have a choice now. We can continue this endless cycle of violence, or we can choose a different path, a path of peace, of healing." As the sun began to set on the bloodied fields of Ravenwood, a fragile hope began to blossom. Enemy warriors who had been locked in mortal combat mere hours before now helped each other tend to wounds and bury the dead. The survivors of Ravenwood, expecting execution, found themselves instead offered mercy and a chance at a new beginning. And so, from the ashes of Eric Bloodhawk's reign of terror, a new era was born. One built not on vengeance and bloodshed, but on the hard-won wisdom that peace, however difficult, was always preferable to the hollow victory of revenge. As night fell, Bjorn stood alone amidst the ruins of Ravenwood. He looked down at the body of his old friend, the man who had become both his greatest enemy and his greatest regret. "Rest now, Eric," he said softly. "Your fight is over. May you find in death the peace that eluded you in life." With that, he turned away, leaving behind the ghosts of the past and walking towards a future bright with the promise of hard-won peace. The legend of Ravenwood and Eric Bloodhawk would live on, not as a tale of glory and vengeance, but as a stark reminder of the true cost of hatred and the redemptive power of forgiveness. The first thing I became aware of was pain, a deep, throbbing ache that seemed to permeate every fiber of my being. Then came the realization that I was, impossibly, alive. I opened my eyes slowly, wincing at the dim light filtering through a small window. As my vision cleared, I found myself in a humble dwelling, lying on a rough-hewn bed. The air was thick with the scent of herbs and smoke. "So the Butcher of Ravenwood awakens," a raspy voice said. I turned my head, grimacing at the effort, to see an old woman sitting by the bedside. It took me a moment to recognize her, the seer who had come to Ravenwood with her dire prophecy. "You," I croaked, my voice barely more than a whisper. "How?" She leaned forward, her eyes glinting with an unsettling mix of wisdom and mischief. "How are you alive? Or how did you come to be in my care?" Both questions with complicated answers. Eric Bloodhawk. I tried to sit up but fell back with a groan. The old woman, Helga, I remembered, clucked her tongue disapprovingly. "Lie still, you fool. You're lucky to be breathing, let alone moving." As the fog of pain and confusion began to clear, memories of the battle rushed back. The fall of Ravenwood, the clash with Bjorn, the searing pain of his blade. "Ravenwood," I gasped. "What happened? My people." Helga's face grew solemn. "Ravenwood has fallen, Eric. Your reign of terror is at an end." The words hit me like a physical blow. I closed my eyes, overwhelmed by a tidal wave of emotions, grief, anger, and beneath it all, a strange sense of relief. "And my people?" I asked, dreading the answer. "Those who survived have been granted mercy," Helga replied. "Bjorn, your old friend, has called for peace. He's trying to break the cycle of violence as you asked of him with your dying breath." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "Then it wasn't all for nothing," I murmured. Helga snorted. "That depends on your definition of nothing, doesn't it? How many lives were lost? How many villages burned? All for your quest for vengeance." Her words stung, but I couldn't deny their truth. "Why did you save me?" I asked, changing the subject. "Why not let me die with Ravenwood?" The old seer's eyes softened slightly. "Because, Eric Bloodhawk, your story isn't finished yet. You have a part still to play in breaking this cycle of violence." Over the next few weeks, as my body slowly healed, Helga told me of the changes sweeping across the land. Bjorn had kept his word, working tirelessly to forge alliances between former enemies. The survivors of Ravenwood, rather than being executed, were being integrated into their communities. It wasn't an easy process. There was too much bad blood for that. But it was a start. As for me, the world believed Eric Bloodhawk had died in the fall of Ravenwood. And in a way, they were right. The man I had been, consumed by hatred and vengeance, had perished on that battlefield. Who I was now, that remained to be seen. When I was finally strong enough to leave my bed, Helga presented me with a set of simple clothes and a walking stick. "It's time for you to go," she said. "Your body has healed, but your soul, that's a wound that will take far longer to mend." I nodded, understanding the wisdom in her words. Where should I go? Helga shrugged. That's for you to decide. But remember, Eric, you carry the weight of your deeds with you. Use that burden to fuel your redemption, not drag you back into darkness. And so I set out, a ghost walking among the living. I traveled from village to village, my hair and beard grown long, my once imposing frame now lean and weathered. None recognized me as the fearsome Eric Bloodhawk, and I was content to keep it that way. I listened to the stories told around campfires, hearing tales of my own brutality that made my stomach churn. But I also heard whispers of hope, of communities coming together to rebuild what had been destroyed. Months passed, and I found myself drawn back to familiar territories. It was dangerous, I knew, but I couldn't resist the pull of my past. And that's how I found myself on the outskirts of a village that had once trembled at the mere mention of Ravenwood. As I approached, I saw a group of children playing near the edge of the forest. Among them was a young boy, no more than 10 years old, with a shock of red hair that reminded me painfully of Leif. The boy noticed me first, his eyes widening at the sight of the grizzled stranger. "Who are you?" he called out, a mix of curiosity and wariness in his voice. I hesitated, then replied softly, "Just an old man with too many stories." The boy's face lit up. "Stories? Will you tell us one?" Before I could respond, a woman's voice rang out. "Eric, what have I told you about talking to strangers?" The woman who hurried over stopped short when she saw me, her face paling. I recognized her immediately. She had been one of the survivors of Ravenwood. "You," she whispered, her hand instinctively reaching for her son. I held up my hands, showing I meant no harm. "Peace," I said. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm just passing through." She studied me for a long moment, conflict clear on her face. Finally, she asked, "Have you traveled far?" I nodded. Far enough to see the changes in this land, to hear the stories of war and of peace. Something in my words seemed to reach her. She relaxed slightly, though her hand remained on her son's shoulder. "Then perhaps you have a story to share? It's been a long winter and we could use some fresh tales." I hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I have many stories, but they're not all pleasant ones. The best stories rarely are," she replied. And so I found myself seated by the village's central fire, surrounded by curious faces, both young and old. As the flames danced, casting flickering shadows, I began to speak. "This is a story of vengeance and its cost," I said, my voice low but carrying in the hushed night. "It's the tale of a man named Eric, who lost everything he loved to the cruelty of war." I told them everything, the Saxon raid that destroyed my old life, the years of bloodshed and conquest, the fall of Ravenwood. I spoke of the monster I had become, and of the price paid by both my enemies and my own people. Throughout it all, I never claimed it as my own story, but I saw understanding dawn in the eyes of the older listeners. When I finished, a heavy silence fell over the gathering. It was the boy, Eric, who broke it. "But what happened to Eric?" he asked, his young face troubled. "Did he die in the battle?" I met his gaze, seeing in him the innocence I had lost so long ago. "In a way, he did," I replied softly. "The man he had been could not survive the fall of all he had built. But perhaps a part of him lived on, seeking redemption for his sins." The boy's mother spoke up, her voice thick with emotion. "And did he find it? This redemption?" I looked around at the faces surrounding me, former enemies and victims, now neighbors and friends. In their eyes I saw not hatred or fear, but a cautious hope. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "Redemption isn't something given. It's earned through actions day by day. Eric's story isn't over yet, and neither is ours." As the gathering broke up, people departing with subdued murmurs, the woman approached me. "I know who you are," she said quietly. "Or who you were." I nodded, not bothering to deny it. "Are you going to tell the others?" She was silent for a long moment, then shook her head. "No. The Eric Bloodhawk I knew died at Ravenwood. The man I see before me, he's someone else. Someone seeking a different path. Relief washed over me, followed quickly by shame. I don't deserve your mercy, I said. Perhaps not, she agreed. But mercy isn't about deserving. It's about breaking the cycle, as Bjorn said. It's about choosing a better way. As she turned to go, she paused. Will you stay? There's much work to be done here, rebuilding what was destroyed. We could use an extra pair of hands. I looked at her, then at the village beyond, a place that had once cowered in fear of Ravenwood, now offering me a chance at redemption. Yes, I said, feeling the weight of my past and the possibility of a different future. I'll stay. And so I did. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months. I worked alongside those I had once terrorized, rebuilding homes and lives. I shared my knowledge of farming and craftsmanship, skills long buried beneath the bloodlust of war. And each night I told stories, not just of battle and vengeance, but of forgiveness and hope. One evening, as the sun set on another day of honest labor, I found myself alone by the village well. As I drew water, I caught sight of my reflection in the bucket, a face lined with age and sorrow, but with eyes that no longer burned with hatred. Well, Eric Bloodhawk, I murmured to my reflection, what do you see now? I see a man trying to make amends, a familiar voice said behind me. I turned to find Bjorn standing there, older and grayer, but with the same steady gaze I remembered from our youth. Bjorn, I said, my voice hoarse with emotion. How did you know? He smiled sadly. Did you think I wouldn't recognize my oldest friend even beneath that beard and those scars? I've known you were alive for months. I tensed, ready for the accusation, the anger, but Bjorn simply sighed and sat on the edge of the well. I didn't come to drag you back in chains, Eric. I came to see for myself if the rumors were true, if the butcher of Ravenwood had truly changed. I sat beside him, feeling the weight of our shared history. And what do you see? I asked. Bjorn was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the village as the first stars appeared in the twilight sky. I see a man haunted by his past, but no longer controlled by it. I see someone trying, day by day, to balance the scales of a ledger that can never truly be settled. I nodded, acknowledging the truth of his words. Is it enough? I asked softly. Bjorn turned to me, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and hope. That's not for me to decide, old friend. But I will say this. The fact that you're asking that question, that you're here trying to make amends, it's a start. We sat in companionable silence as night fell fully, the village settling into the peace of evening. Finally, Bjorn stood. I'll keep your secret, Eric. The world can go on believing that Eric Bloodhawk died at Ravenwood. But remember, every day you have a choice. You can continue on this path of redemption, or you can fall back into old habits. The choice, as always, is yours. As he turned to go, I called out, Bjorn, thank you for everything. He paused, looking back with a small smile. We were brothers once, Eric. Perhaps in time we can be again. And with that he was gone, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the vast expanse of stars above. As I made my way back to the small hut now called home, I passed Eirik and his mother. The boy waved excitedly. Will you tell us another story tonight? He asked. I smiled, feeling a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with the summer evening. Of course, I replied. But this time, let's tell a story of hope, of second chances and new beginnings. As I settled in to spin my tale, surrounded by faces that no longer looked at me with fear, I realized that this moment of peace, of connection, was worth more than all the bloody conquests of my past. The legacy of Eric Bloodhawk would always be one of violence and pain, but perhaps in these small moments of redemption, in these stories of a better way, I could forge a new legacy, one of healing, of breaking the cycle that had consumed so much of my life. It wouldn't be easy. The weight of my sins would always be with me. But as I looked into the eager faces of those gathered around, I knew that this chance to make amends, to help build something better, was a gift I didn't deserve but would spend the rest of my days trying to earn. And so Eric Bloodhawk, once the scourge of Ravenwood, now just a man seeking redemption, began his story anew.